The fourth day of Diddy's trial was supposed to be just another routine cross-examination. Instead, it spiraled into a complete disaster. What started as an attempt to discredit Cassie Ventura exploded into chaos, exposing not just the cracks in Diddy's defense, but the cracks in Diddy himself. In a federal courtroom that has already witnessed bombshell after bombshell, Thursday, May 15th, became the day everything changed. Diddy's own ego took center stage, his legal team stumbled, the judge lost his patience, and the jury? They sat there, watching a man once hailed as a music mogul unravel in real time. Forget the headlines, forget the blog spin. What really happened inside that courtroom was worse than anything Diddy's PR machine could cover up. This isn't just a bad day for Diddy, it's the beginning of the end. Now, let's walk you through exactly how Day 4 became the disaster that humiliated Diddy in front of the world. May 15th, 2025, Day 4 of Sean Diddy Combs' federal trial. What was supposed to be a controlled, strategic day in court turned into an absolute disaster. And the worst part? Diddy has no one to blame but himself. Let's take you inside that Manhattan courtroom, where the air was already thick with tension from the moment the doors opened. The day before, Cassie Ventura's direct examination had come to a close. For 2 days, she had held herself with poise, recounting years of alleged abuse, manipulation, and humiliation. Now it was the defense's turn to cross-examine her, their chance to poke holes, create doubt, shift the narrative. But instead of seizing that opportunity with precision, Diddy's defense team, led by attorney Anna Ostavio, came in like amateurs trying to play chess with a sledgehammer. From the very first moments of cross-examination, their strategy was clear: portray Cassie as a willing participant in the so-called freak-offs, using decade-old emails and text messages where Cassie, under very different circumstances, had appeared to consent. But here's the thing about strategy. Execution matters. And this was a train wreck in slow motion. Ostavio read out explicit messages where Cassie had joked about being always ready for a freak-off. In another, she referenced deleting a private video and calling it dope. Their goal was obvious: paint her as someone who was not only consenting, but enthusiastic. But Cassie did not flinch. Calmly, she acknowledged those messages, and then she hit back with context that changed everything. At the time, she said, "I thought that's what I had to do to keep him happy. But it was more than that. It was control, fear, addiction." The courtroom was silent, because what the defense failed to grasp is that consent under coercion is not consent. And the more they pushed, the clearer that became. But the real disaster started when Diddy, frustrated, fuming, decided to take matters into his own hands. You see, he didn't physically stand up, but metaphorically, he hijacked the entire defense. Observers in the room noticed it immediately. Diddy started furiously scribbling notes, passing them to his attorneys mid-examination. Questions that were clumsy, petty, personal, not designed to dismantle Cassie's testimony, designed to humiliate her. Suddenly, the defense was no longer in control. Diddy was running the show. Questions about Kid Cudi, about studio time, about who Cassie was seen with in public. None of it moved the legal needle. But for Diddy, this was personal. And that's when Judge Aaron snapped. The judge had already been growing impatient. Earlier that morning, he had reprimanded the defense for dragging out the cross-examination, reminding them sternly that Cassie was 8.5 months pregnant, that she could give birth at any moment. And yet, the defense, clearly stalling, had told the court they'd need the rest of the day and all of tomorrow. That was the moment the judge's patience evaporated. His words were sharp, controlled, but deadly. "This is the exact opposite of what I was told. This witness was to be off the stand by the end of this week, and now you're telling me otherwise? You could feel the shift in the room, the jury, the prosecution, even Diddy's own legal team. They all knew this was spiraling. The defense attorneys started shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact. Meanwhile, the prosecution sat silent, letting the defense self-destruct. But Diddy wasn't done making things worse. Overnight, his team had dumped over 300 new exhibits on the court, last-minute evidence dumps designed to overwhelm, confuse, and delay. The judge was furious. He called them out directly for their gamesmanship. "You had ample time to submit these," he said. "This tactic is unacceptable." In that moment, it became painfully clear. Diddy's team wasn't just disorganized, they were flailing. And Diddy, sitting there, isolated, visibly seething. His legal team now standing a few feet away from him, as if keeping their distance might somehow protect them from the fallout. But the courtroom wasn't buying it. Not the judge, not the jury, not the public. This wasn't strategy, this was desperation. And Cassie, despite being heavily pregnant, despite the relentless, invasive questioning, she never lost her composure. She reminded everyone in that room of why they were there, of the abuse, the control, the fear. She testified that what looked like consent in those texts was the result of psychological manipulation, that what seemed like willing participation was in fact survival under coercion. Every time Diddy tried to twist the narrative, Cassie brought it back to the core truth. And as Diddy's frustration grew, so did the jury's sympathy for her. The body language was impossible to ignore. Jurors leaning forward, taking notes, exchanging glances as Diddy's team stumbled through irrelevant questions. Questions that did nothing but confirm the prosecution's narrative. And then came the most damning moment. Cassie testified unequivocally that Diddy was a drug addict, not just casual use, heavy daily use of cocaine, MDMA, unicorn pills, everything. And during withdrawal, he was volatile, dangerous, completely unhinged. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This was deliberate, and it landed with force. The prosecution couldn't have asked for a better moment. Because with that, Cassie's testimony tied back directly to the broader RICO charges: abuse, coercion, manipulation, drug-fueled violence. This wasn't isolated. This was systemic. By mid-afternoon, the defense's cross-examination was in shambles. Diddy had taken what should have been a chance to cast doubt and turned it into a public, humiliating spectacle. The very thing he was so desperately trying to avoid, losing control of the narrative, happened right in front of him. The blogs might have eaten up the sensational questions, but in that courtroom, the reality was stark. This wasn't a win. This was a collapse. And as Judge Aaron laid down the final warning that the defense had until the next morning to finish their questioning, or else, Diddy sat there, defeated. A man who once controlled the music industry, the media, and public perception was now losing control in the one place that mattered most, the courtroom. And day 4 will go down as the day Diddy sabotaged his own defense. But the courtroom drama wasn't over yet. While Diddy sat there simmering, his legal team scrambling to regain footing, another layer of humiliation unfolded, one that exposed not just his defense's incompetence, but the cold, hard reality of this trial. Throughout Cassie's testimony, it became clearer by the minute. Diddy had spent years crafting an illusion. The relationship he boasted about wasn't built on love or partnership. It was built on power, control, fear. The defense tried desperately to redirect, to frame Cassie as the jealous ex, angry she never got a ring, bitter she wasn't official. They brought up other women, Kim Porter, Gina Hine, hoping to strike a nerve. But what they didn't anticipate was how calmly, almost clinically, Cassie dismantled their narrative. "Yes, I was jealous at first," she admitted, "but eventually I understood my place. I wasn't a partner, I was property." That sentence alone felt like a sledgehammer. You could feel the jury's reaction, a collective tightening of jaws, shifting in seats. These were not the words of a bitter ex. This was the testimony of a survivor. And Diddy? He couldn't stay quiet. Even as his attorneys tried to follow courtroom protocol, Diddy kept pushing his questions, scribbled notes, aggressive whispers, every personal jab, every humiliating question about Cassie's private life. It wasn't helping his case. It was making things worse. Legal analysts in the room watched in disbelief. This wasn't a defense strategy. This was ego, raw and unfiltered, playing itself out in real time. But the real blow came with the tapes. The prosecution had already established a pattern of abuse, but now testimony shifted to the so-called freak-off tapes, videos allegedly used by Diddy to blackmail Cassie into silence. In court, Cassie described the psychological torture of knowing those tapes existed, recorded without genuine consent, used as weapons, tools of control. The defense's response? To minimize, deflect, suggest she had enjoyed those encounters. But with every flippant question, Diddy's team walked straight into a trap. Because Cassie didn't deny the tapes existed. She didn't deny past messages where she might have downplayed her trauma. But she kept returning to one truth. It started with manipulation, it escalated to addiction, and it ended in abuse. That simple progression became the backbone of her testimony, and the jury was listening. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the prosecution's strategy was becoming evident. They weren't rushing. They weren't reacting to Diddy's courtroom circus. They were methodically laying the groundwork, brick by brick, for the RICO case. Every witness, every exhibit, every moment of Cassie's testimony was serving a larger narrative. This wasn't just about a toxic relationship. This was about organized, systemic abuse. By the afternoon recess, courtroom observers noted something telling. Diddy's legal team had physically distanced themselves from him. What had been a tightly knit table of whispered strategies had become fractured. His lawyers stood feet away, huddling among themselves, while Diddy sat isolated, arms crossed, visibly furious. At one point, a reporter described it as Diddy looking like Magneto in court, brooding, disconnected, fuming with no more tricks to play. And that's when the judge dropped the final hammer of the day. Judge Aaron made it explicitly clear. The defense had 12 hours left to finish their cross-examination. No more stalling, no more last-minute evidence dumps, no more surprise witnesses. Cassie's testimony would conclude on time, period. For Diddy, this was a crushing blow. His entire courtroom strategy, delay, distract, overwhelm, had been shattered. The prosecution, composed and relentless, sat ready. And with every misstep from Diddy's side, they grew stronger. The blogs might have been flooded with sensational headlines, crafted by Diddy's media machine. But inside that courtroom, reality was setting in. Diddy was not winning. His attempt to dominate the cross-examination had backfired spectacularly. Instead of discrediting Cassie, he had confirmed her every claim. His ego had taken the wheel, and in doing so, he had steered his defense straight into a wall. As the day came to a close, one thing was undeniable. Day 4 had been catastrophic for Diddy, and for a man who built his empire on controlling the narrative, losing control in that courtroom was the ultimate humiliation. As the courtroom emptied that evening, the outside world was already buzzing. Diddy's carefully planted headlines were doing their job. Social media exploded with posts dissecting every text message, every smirk, every insinuation the defense had tossed at Cassie. Troll farms and paid PR campaigns were hard at work. Cassie exposed Diddy's day of redemption. The usual clickbait flooded timelines. But inside the Southern District of New York courthouse, reality told a very different story. Seasoned legal analysts were unanimous. Diddy had fumbled spectacularly. His attempt to hijack the defense's cross-examination, turning it into a personal vendetta, had only served to validate the prosecution's case. Every question aimed at shaming Cassie, every off-topic tangent about past relationships, did nothing but reinforce the very image Diddy was trying to erase. An image of a man who believed his money, his power, his ego placed him above consequences. The jury saw that, and more importantly, they felt it. Throughout the day, jurors watched Diddy's behavior shift. The smirking mogul from day one was now visibly agitated, his confidence cracking under the weight of Cassie's calm, unwavering testimony. One juror was seen taking meticulous notes, glancing repeatedly at Diddy's reactions rather than the witnesses. Another juror, once seemingly neutral, now sat with arms folded, an unmistakable expression of disapproval. For the prosecution, this was gold, because while Diddy fought for control of the headlines, they were winning where it mattered, in the courtroom. Behind the scenes, the government's strategy was methodical. They knew Diddy's ego would be his undoing. They anticipated his outbursts, his attempts to dominate. All they had to do was stay patient, let him unravel publicly, and keep the legal focus sharp. And that's exactly what they did. With every misstep from the defense, the prosecution tightened the narrative. This wasn't a messy breakup. This was organized abuse. This was coercion. This was a pattern, not an isolated incident. The RICO charges, which some had dismissed early on as a reach, suddenly felt much closer to home. Because Diddy hadn't just harmed Cassie, he had allegedly created an entire infrastructure to facilitate and conceal his actions. Drivers, assistants, employees who became enablers in his web of control. Day 4 exposed all of this, not through bombshell evidence, but through Diddy's own courtroom behavior. By trying to control the narrative, he had revealed the truth. Even his legal team couldn't hide their frustration. At one point, courtroom reporters noted how Diddy's lawyers stood away from him, whispering among themselves, visibly anxious. The body language was unmistakable. Damage control. And yet, Diddy pressed on. Every time his attorneys tried to regain focus, he would scribble another note, push another humiliating question towards Cassie. Questions that didn't refute the facts. Questions that only underscored his obsession with image and dominance. It was, as one analyst put it, a masterclass in self-destruction. The judge's patience, already tested by last-minute evidence dumps and scheduling delays, had worn thin. By mandating a strict 12-hour deadline to wrap up Cassie's cross-examination, Judge Aaron sent a clear message. This circus was over, and with that, Diddy's strategy of chaos collapsed. In the court of public opinion, his PR team might win a few viral moments, but in that federal courtroom, the damage was done. Cassie had stood her ground. The prosecution had laid its foundation, and Diddy had, through his own actions, validated every accusation of control, coercion, and abuse. Day 4 wasn't just a disaster for Diddy, it was a turning point. For a man who spent his career shaping narratives, spinning scandals, and buying silence, losing control of his own story, on the record, under oath, was the ultimate humiliation. And as court adjourned, with Cassie set to return for what could be her final day on the stand, one thing was certain. Diddy walked into that courtroom believing he could bend the truth to his will. But on May 15, 2025, the truth fought back, and it left him humiliated. As the courthouse lights dimmed and the legal teams retreated behind closed doors, Outside, a very different battle was raging. The media circus was in full swing. Across social platforms, snippets of Diddy's planted narratives flooded the feeds. Viral tweets dissected Cassie's old text messages. Desperate clickbait headlines screamed, "Cassie caught in lies." A last-ditch attempt to twist perception, but seasoned observers knew better. Reputable legal analysts, former federal prosecutors, and investigative journalists who had been in that courtroom all day took to the airwaves with a unified message: Diddy lost today, badly. Because here's what really happened. Diddy's defense had banked everything on painting Cassie as a scorned ex-girlfriend, a willing participant, a woman who, they claimed, used her relationship with Diddy for personal gain. But every time they pushed that narrative, Cassie responded with clarity, composure, and painful honesty. She acknowledged her past messages, didn't flinch when confronted with intimate exchanges, but she also explained, patiently, unflinchingly, how abuse doesn't start with violence, how manipulation builds slowly, how control replaces affection, how love turns into fear. For the jury, it wasn't just Cassie's words that resonated, it was Diddy's reactions, his visible frustration, the frantic note-passing, the way he micromanaged his own legal team. These were not the actions of an innocent man calmly defending his reputation. They were the behaviors of someone used to getting his way, now cornered by a system he couldn't buy or bully into silence. And the prosecution? They stayed silent, focused, letting Diddy unravel before their eyes. What's more, the defense's shock tactics backfired spectacularly, introducing over 400 new exhibits at the last minute. An obvious attempt to drown the court in paperwork only infuriated the judge and highlighted their lack of preparation. Every delay, every stall, every half-baked argument chipped away at their credibility. This wasn't the smooth, calculated defense of an innocent man. This was chaos, desperation. By the end of day 4, the narrative was no longer controlled by tabloids or PR firms. It belonged to the court, and in the court's view, Diddy was sinking fast. Legal experts pointed out how Diddy's own actions had satisfied critical elements of the RICO charges. His entourage, drivers, assistants, bodyguards, weren't just employees. In the context of this case, they became co-conspirators, instrumental in maintaining his control over victims. The sex trafficking allegations, which required proof of coercion and force, were no longer abstract claims. They were being demonstrated in real time by Diddy himself. Every time he dismissed Cassie's words, every time he tried to humiliate her with irrelevant questions, every time he acted like this was his stage, not a federal courtroom. And for the jury, those 12 individuals whose verdict would decide his fate, the picture was becoming clearer with every hour. This wasn't about salacious headlines anymore. This was about power, abuse, and accountability, and Diddy was losing. Now, as the court prepared for the next day, with Cassie's time on the stand nearing its court-imposed deadline, the stakes had never been higher. For the prosecution, the foundation was set. For Diddy, the walls were closing in. And as much as he fought to control the narrative outside, inside that courtroom, reality was catching up. Fast. Day 4 was supposed to be his comeback. It became his undoing. As day 4 came to a close, one thing was undeniable. Sean Diddy Combs had turned his own trial into a public unraveling, not because of Cassie's testimony alone, but because of his own ego. By hijacking his defense, by obsessing over public perception instead of legal reality, Diddy exposed the very behaviors at the heart of the prosecution's case: control, coercion, and a blatant disregard for boundaries. Inside that courtroom, away from the noise of social media, Diddy wasn't the untouchable mogul. He was a defendant, and the jury was watching every move, every interruption, every deflection, every moment of visible rage when the narrative slipped from his grasp. Legal analysts were blunt. Day 4 was a disaster for Diddy. His defense team was disjointed, his strategies backfired, and his personal attacks on Cassie only reinforced her credibility. The RICO elements, once seen as ambitious by some, were now firmly in play. Because the evidence wasn't just in emails or videos, it was in the power dynamics, the way Diddy mobilized his staff, the way he isolated his victims, the way he used fear, loyalty, and financial leverage to maintain control. By trying to discredit Cassie, Diddy had inadvertently proven the prosecution's case, and the jury, they weren't swayed by last-minute spectacle. They saw a powerful man spiraling, a man whose empire was built not just on business acumen, but on exploitation. As court adjourned, the prosecution remained composed, silently building toward what would be a devastating conclusion. For Diddy, however, the damage was already done. He had entered Day 4 hoping to reclaim the narrative. He left with his reputation in shambles, his legal team scrambling, and his future hanging by a thread. Tomorrow, Day 5, will bring new witnesses, new revelations. But one thing is clear after today: the myth of Diddy's invincibility has been shattered, and no amount of media manipulation can save him now, because in the eyes of the court, and increasingly in the eyes of the public, Sean Combs is no longer the architect of his legacy. He is the author of his own downfall. This was Day 4 of Diddy's trial, a turning point, a disaster of his own making, and the beginning of the end.